Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do a bit of a different video, and that is a discussion, not something I do a lot on my channel, but today I felt somewhat inspired to talk about my problem with the current state of the horror publishing industry. And it's just my issue with a lot of the new releases that are coming out. You've heard before on my channel that while I love horror, I've been really struggling to enjoy and love some of the newer books that are coming out, and I often think that it's me, but maybe it's actually the publishing industry and the direction that these trends are going. So I'm going to attempt to explain my feelings about how I feel about modern horror and what works and what doesn't work for me. This is just my opinion. This is just an off-the-cuff video, so bear in mind that if you disagree, that is totally fair. I am not the know-all be-all of the genre. I am just a reader, an avid fan, and someone who just wants to talk about this online and see if anyone else agrees with me. All that being said, let's get started. So for those of you that have followed my channel for a long time, you've heard me say that recently I have been more hit or miss when it comes to horror. I consider myself a huge horror fan, but if you watch a lot of my wrap-ups, you find me being very critical of the horror books that I'm reading. I don't always love them. I tend to have a lot of unpopular opinions, and sometimes it's me, sometimes it's my mood, but I've started to think about it more and realize that it's not necessarily that I don't like horror, but I am not enjoying the kind of horror books that are getting published today. And of course there are exceptions. I've given you recommendations over the last year and so of books that I do enjoy, but there's a lot of horror coming out that just is not to my taste. And in my opinion, it comes down to the fact that horror has gotten mainstream. Now, I know that makes me sound like a huge hipster, and trust me, I am not. I am someone who loves all the pop songs on the radio and all of those mainstream things. But when it comes to horror, I first got into the genre before it was popular. And so honestly, the reason I started reading horror was because Stephanie from the Books and Freezer podcast was starting it up and needed a co-host, and she invited me to join up. And I said, I don't actually read horror, but I'm willing to start. And so I started reading the genre and falling in love with it. And my love for it just went from there. However, at the time we were recording it, I give Stephanie great credit that she really had a lot of insight into the coming popularity of the genre, because when she first had the idea for the podcast, she looked online and said, this kind of podcast doesn't exist. Yes, there were horror fiction podcasts, but to have something that was recommending horror novels was not something that you were actually seeing online. And so she really saw this as a need, as a niche, and went for it. And now I would say that there's a lot more horror fiction and nonfiction podcasts out there competing for space, and there's just a lot more popularity. And of course, you've seen major imprints that are coming out that are focused specifically on horror now, which got me really excited when it was happening, and I'm still grateful that it is. But because of that, I find that the horror genre is getting saturated with a lot of weak titles. So again, there's always exceptions, but I'll be honest that what I'm seeing now is that there's a lot of thrillers that are getting marketed as horror, and while I try not to be a genre gatekeeper, when I read them, they just don't give me those horror feels. And this is interesting because it used to be the opposite. Years ago, when I was trying to find books for the Books and Freezer podcast, often I would end up picking up books that were marketed as being a thriller, and then once I read them, I was like, this totally counts as horror, and would include them in those podcast episodes. And now you're seeing the opposite. I think this came from the fact that years ago, when things like Gone Girl came out, the thriller genre got super popular, and so everything that could technically be called a thriller was called a thriller in order to increase its marketing reach. And now you're seeing the opposite, where people are eager to read horror books, and so you're getting these thrillers that are kind of creepy and sort of walking on the edge of horror and getting the horror label slapped on them. And I just don't think that's fair, because I've said before in my videos that it comes to expectations. I don't necessarily think that books are good or bad. I always say that they're meant for certain readers, and a lot of that comes from the fact that you need the right expectations going into a book, so that if you're looking for a particular thing, you're going to pick up the right book that's going to give you that experience. And for me, I keep reading these books that are being called horror, and then I'm very let down because I don't feel like they're giving me that experience. The other thing with horror becoming more mainstream is that I'm seeing something happening that just is not to my taste, and that's the fact that I'm seeing a lot of very surface level horror books. So they follow the tropes of the genre, they read like the book version of a horror movie, but they lack the substance that I've fallen in love with the genre. So if you're not aware, horror has a long legacy, and not just a long legacy of being scary books, but specifically reflecting back on society. So things that were taboo or inappropriate were being called out in horror books in very smart, nuanced ways. And so in a lot of cases, horror books were well ahead of their time, giving social commentary in really creative ways and just using the archetype of and structure, and just using the structure of a horror book in order to have some really interesting discussions. So I love books that have really complex plots and themes, and the author is playing with different ideas. And I find, again, a lot of newer horror books, you just have a haunted house and it's haunted and people live there, and then it's haunted and spooky things happen, and then they get out of the house or they don't, and that's the end of the story. And I feel like those authors fail to understand that the books that really made the genre so popular were ones that really worked on a psychological level, the ones that were reflective of motherhood and fertility and race and culture and so many other nuanced things. So I'll be honest, I'm pretty disappointed with some of the things coming out, and I just feel like the authors are playing it safe. They're looking for an easy buck and just looking to kind of play into a genre that they think is going to be popular, whether or not they actually understand what they're writing or really have the same love for that genre. And of course, again, there are always exceptions. You've heard me rave about books that I do love. Of course, if I give a positive review, it's because I genuinely think it's a good book. There are plenty of authors out there that are incredibly passionate about the genre, and you can see it in their work. But not everyone is like that. I would never name names. I'm not going to point out any specific books in this video, but I just feel like the genre is getting a little bit diluted, and I think that's a shame because a lot of people are picking up horror books for the first time, but they're not getting the full experience I want them to have, and I think that they're settling for a lot less than what the horror genre can offer. So that is it for this really quick video here. Don't worry, I'm still gonna stick to my regular content, so this is just a bonus video for you all. I would love to hear your opinions down below, and again, you do not need to agree with me, but do you think that the horror genre has changed as it has gotten more popular? Do you find that it's gotten a bit more diluted with a lot more weaker books that are coming out that really fail to shine a light on what makes the horror genre oh so good to those of us that have been religiously reading the genre for years, well before it became popular? So I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Even if you completely disagree, that is totally allowed. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy. You can help me out by sharing this video around online, giving it a thumbs up, hitting that notification bell, and if you drop a little emoji, even like a book, that does help me out as well. Thank you so much. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.